Let capital F of x equal to small f times small g. So capital F is a product of two functions, f and g. We want to find the derivative of capital F, which is the derivative of the product of these two functions, little f and little g. And this is the product rule of differentiation. This derivative is equal to first function little f times the derivative of g plus the derivative of little f times g. Now in many calculus courses today, this is just given to students without deriving it. I think it's very important that every calculus student should see the derivation of this rule. This will help you understand it better and also understand more theoretical results better a little bit later on. So we're going to use a definition of the derivative. The derivative of capital F by definition is limit as h goes to 0, capital F of x plus h minus capital F of x divided by h. So let's do this in 4 steps. The first step, f of x plus h, capital F, is equal to little f of x plus h times g of x plus h. We just replace every x that we see with x plus h. So second step is to write f of x plus h minus capital F of x, and that's little f of x plus h times the little g of x plus h minus the product of little f with g. Now we can't do anything here, we can't factor at all, but let's do the following in this step. I'm going to take what we have, f of x plus h times g of x plus h, and I'm going to add f of x plus h times just g of x and subtract f of x plus h times g of x, and then minus f of x times g of x. Notice this is the same thing that we had before. Since I added and subtracted these two terms, that's 0. So I basically added 0 to the original expression and nothing has changed. But why make it more complicated? Well, the reason is we're going to take this first term and this third term, and then we're going to take the second term and the fourth term and combine them. Notice that the first and the third term have f of x plus h in common, and then when we factor it out, we have g of x plus h minus g of x left. Now let's turn to second and fourth term. They have g of x in common, so we factor g of x, and that leaves f of x plus h minus f of x. And that's the end of step 2. In step 3, we're just going to take what we did in step 2 and divide that by h in preparation for taking the limit. So here's the result, the end result of step 2. This is f of x plus h times the difference g of x plus h minus g of x. Let's divide that by h, and then plus g of x times f of x plus h minus f of x, divide that by h also. That's the end of step 3. We go to step 4 for the solution. The derivative f prime of x, capital F prime, which is of course the derivative of the product of little f with little g, is equal to the limit as h goes to 0, capital F of x plus h minus capital F of x, divide that by h. Now let's bring in what we did at the end of step 3. We have these two limits. The first limit is limit as h approaches 0, f of x plus h times g of x plus h minus g of x all over h, plus limit h approaches 0, g of x times f of x plus h minus f of x all over h. Now let's simplify this further. The first of these limits will break up into two limits because h is present. So the first one will be limit as h goes to 0 of f of x plus h times the limit as h approaches 0 of g of x plus h minus g of x divided by h. And the second limit, g of x, right here, does not depend on h, so we can just pull it out in front of the limit. So it's g of x times the limit h approaches 0, f of x plus h minus f of x divided by h. We are now ready to show the product rule, derive the product rule. Let's look at these four limits. First, this right here, as h goes to 0, limit h goes to 0, f of x plus h is just f of x. Limit as h goes to 0, g of x plus h minus g of x over h, that's the definition of the derivative of g, so that's g prime, plus g of x times the limit h goes to 0 of f of x plus h minus f of x over h, well that's f prime. And that's the product rule. So it's first times the derivative of the second plus second times the derivative of the first. So we just showed that the derivative of a product of two functions, f of x times g of x prime, is f of x times g prime of x, plus we can reverse these or keep them the same, f prime of x times g of x. And that's the product rule. Very important, so make sure you know how to derive it, and then you'll be using it many, many times in your calculus careers.